Thanks so much, Stephen and Matt, for the kind introduction and for having me today. Let me go ahead and share screens. Make sure this is working. All right. I'm assuming you all can see.
It's there. It's perfect. Thank you, Jessica.
Wonderful. Okay. I'll see if I can cut a few minutes off of this so that all our speakers have enough time here. But thanks again for having me today. So I'm going to present work that we are doing at the People Lab, which, as Stephen said in his introduction, is based at the Harvard Kennedy School. And this is joint work with my colleagues at the People Lab, including Elizabeth Linos and Heidi Wallace. So let me see. There we go. Okay. So this work is focused on housing voucher programs in the United States. These are government-funded programs that provide subsidies for very low-income families to rent homes on the private market. So in voucher programs, renters who have a voucher pay a portion of their rent that's dictated by their income, and then the government pays the other portion of their rent, and that money goes directly to the landlord. The goal of these programs is to provide safe, stable, and affordable housing, just like many other housing programs. But what's different about voucher programs is it's also one of the stated goals of these programs is also to provide tenants with more choice. So the idea is that a low-income renter with a voucher can go anywhere on the private market, any neighborhood, and they should be able to, rent the home that they want and that is best suited for their family. The largest of these programs is a federal program in the United States called the Housing Choice Voucher Program. This was also called the Section 8 program. That's sort of what it's known as colloquially now. There's also state-run programs that operate very similarly. And so in the study that I'm going to show you results from today in Massachusetts, we're looking both at federal programs and state programs. So there's a number of challenges that these programs face across the country. The first is that they're severely underfunded, and this is at a federal level. So this is one of the few social safety net programs in the United States where demand far exceeds supply. Only about 25% of the eligible low-income population in the United States actually receives a voucher. This means that waiting lists for low-income families that want a voucher are up to, 6, 7, 8 years long in many cities across the country. The challenge is the nature of the program design. Landlords must be willing to participate. So the entire program is premised on this idea that a low-income family with a voucher goes on the private market, finds a landlord, and that landlord has to be willing to accept the voucher. That means they also have to be willing to overcome all of the sort of government bureaucratic hurdles to participation. Unfortunately, up to 30% of families that have a voucher are not able to use them. And you can see examples here of this bottom one here in the bottom, at least right corner for my screen, is a sort of Craigslist advertisement for a rental property where the landlord's saying, sorry, no Section 8 allowed. In many places, but not all places, this is actually illegal. There are laws in many states across the country that landlords are not allowed to discriminate against tenants that have vouchers. They do anyways, and enforcement is very rare. And you can see in this other screenshot that's on the screen, this is actually just from last week, and this is where I live outside of Boston, where you can see someone describing how hard it is to try to find a landlord that's willing to accept a tenant with a voucher. So when we think about the reasons why landlords might not participate, we use what's called the administrative burden framework to think about sort of the three main categories or types of barriers that landlords may face to participating in a voucher program or to accepting a tenant that has a voucher. The first type of barrier is informational. So they might not know about the program, they might not understand how to participate. We conducted around 60 qualitative interviews with landlords in Minneapolis, Minnesota. One of the quotes that we received from one of those landlords is here on the screen saying, I don't know if my unit conforms or could pass inspection. or if it would be super expensive to fix everything to pass, it's old. So this really sort of underscores this idea that maybe, you know, some landlords just don't understand what the program is. They don't understand what they would need to do in order to accept a tenant with a voucher. The second type of barrier is logistical hurdles or barriers. These are sort of all the paperwork and bureaucratic hurdles that a landlord needs to overcome in order to accept a tenant with a voucher. So most voucher programs require inspections of the unit. They all require paperwork and documentation because, again, the money from the government is going directly to the landlord. So not only does the tenant have to go through all of these hurdles to participate, but the landlord does also. And again, you can see a quote from a different landlord here talking about how they felt like the process was just going to be too complicated. And the third type of barrier is what we call psychological burdens or barriers. This is commonly used to refer to the stigma that's associated with tenants who use vouchers. So there are pervasive stereotypes about low-income populations in general. And in this context, there are also very sort of unique and pervasive stereotypes about the types of tenants who use vouchers. So here's another quote from a different landlord that we interviewed describing how they feel like tenants with housing vouchers are, quote, a step behind on the social skills. So they don't communicate as well. They just don't show up in the same way that they would expect their tenants to show up. So all three of these types of barriers may prevent landlords from wanting to or being willing to participate in voucher programs. I'm going to show you results from two studies that we conducted, trying to answer two main questions. The first is, how do landlords perceive voucher programs? What are sort of the relative weights of these different types of barriers that I just showed you? Which ones are sort of most significant? And then the second is a randomized experiment where we tested different types of outreach messaging to better understand which was most effective at increasing landlord interest in voucher programs. Our first study was in Minneapolis, Minnesota. It was in partnership with the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority in March 2022. And in this study, we, in addition to conducting around 60 qualitative interviews, which I already mentioned, we also sent a survey to about 15,000 active landlords in the city. We had about a 7% response rate. And in this survey, we measured quantitatively the three types of barriers that I just outlined. So we tried to measure informational, logistical, and psychological barriers so that we could get a quantitative measure of how landlords perceive each dimension of barrier in Minneapolis's voucher programs. And briefly, just to give you sort of a high-level glimpse of what we found, when we think about learning our informational barriers, almost 90% of respondents to our survey had heard of voucher programs. So there's not at face value, there's not a huge informational barrier to at least knowing that the program exists. What this doesn't capture is if there are additional sort of more nuanced informational barriers, like the quote that we saw a few screens ago, where maybe landlords have heard of the program, but they don't really understand what it means to participate. On compliance or logistical burdens, around half of all respondents believed that the process was both too difficult and too long to make it worth participating. And on stigma or psychological barriers, nearly 3/4 expressed concern about property damage. So this is one of the most common stereotypes, and I'll show you a few others on the next screen, about tenants with vouchers. And so nearly 3/4 expressed concern that if they accepted a tenant with a voucher, their property would be damaged. And what's interesting here and deviates a little bit from some of the other literature in this space is nearly half of our respondents were actually more concerned about the tenants and about property damage than they were about the process of participating. So if we dig into that a little bit more, one of the other questions we asked in this survey was, what do you believe about tenants with vouchers versus a typical tenant that you might get on the private market? And what you're seeing here on the screen are sort of survey responses on a 1 to 10 scale of how well each of these words or phrases describes both tenants with vouchers and typical tenants. So responsible, respectful, hardworking, and knowledgeable about maintaining an apartment. The dark blue bar is typical tenants, and a higher bar means that word or phrase describes them better. So the main takeaway here is on all 4 dimensions, our respondents to this survey view typical tenants as more responsible, more respectful, more hardworking than tenants with vouchers. So these are all very common stereotypes that seem to be, if not at least pervasive, and also preventing or discouraging landlords from wanting to accept tenants with vouchers. In our next study, we worked with a different state in Massachusetts. We worked with the Massachusetts State Office of Executive Housing and Livable Communities. This is a mouthful, but it is basically just their state housing office. And this was last summer. And they wanted to, like many states and jurisdictions across the country, they were trying to increase interest from their landlords in their housing voucher programs. So they were conducting an outreach campaign to just over 120,000 landlords across the state. We designed it as a randomized experiment so that we could test both different message content and message modality. The impact of both message content and modality on engagement with sort of an informational landing page about voucher programs that the state runs, as well as completion of an interest form where landlords could sign up online to get more information about the state's voucher programs, as well as property listings on a website called affordablehousing.com, which is a housing sort of search website geared towards voucher holders. This is still an ongoing study, so all I'm going to show you today is results from our engagement outcome. So when I say we tested message content, this is we tested 4 variations as shown here. Building on sort of those dimensions of barriers and administrative burden that I showed you earlier, as well as the results of the survey from Minneapolis, we created 4 different messages targeting 4 potential barriers to participation. So the first message aimed to motivate or to emphasize the financial benefits of the program. So the content there says, by participating, you'll receive guaranteed and timely rental payments, even if your tenant encounters unexpected financial difficulties. The second message aimed to correct common misperceptions about the process. One of the things we heard in the qualitative interviews and in the surveys were that landlords were afraid that if they participated, they would have to be subject to, a government written lease, which doesn't exist. So here in this message, we were trying to just correct those common misperceptions. The third message is a bit of a status quo type message. So here we emphasized the benefits. Oh, sorry, not the third. The third message is aiming to combat some of those stereotypes I mentioned, where we emphasize the benefits of leasing to tenants with vouchers. So specifically, we emphasize that tenants with vouchers are both stable and long-term renters, which is true. And typically tenants with vouchers stay in the unit for up to 7 or 8 years in Massachusetts, which is a huge benefit to landlords because turnover in tenants is so costly. And then the fourth message is the status quo message, which is emphasizing benefits to the community. This is the type of messaging that a lot of state agencies and public housing authorities across the country typically use, where they emphasize that, landlords play a critical role in the housing market and can help ensure that everyone in the community has a safe, stable, and affordable place to live. This is what the messages looked like in practice. So every message had a couple basic bullets of information on voucher programs. That's these first two bullets of both, I wish I had a clicker, of both the postcard and the letter that you see here. Every message included both of those. So, this is what a voucher program is. Landlords who participate receive a portion of their rent directly from the housing agency each month. Then each message varied in the third and fourth bullets. So some messages only included one additional bullet point that was either, the financial focus, the tenant focus, the community focused, or the process focused message. And then other messages included a combination of two of them. So we're testing basically three things. We're testing the message. We're testing whether combining two motivations is better or worse than just one motivation. And then we're testing letter versus postcard. So the letter version is on the right, the postcard version is on the left of the screen. This is what we found. So in all, because of all those combinations we tested, we had basically 10 different versions of messages. Again, where we had tested each of the four messages individually, as well as every possible combination of two of them. And there's a few main takeaways here. First, the most effective message, which is the message that just emphasized the benefits of voucher tenants, so emphasize that they're reliable and long-term tenants, outperformed all the other messages. And the difference between that message, the most effective one, and the least effective message was about 68%. So the x-axis here is the percent of landlords who received the message that actually clicked through to the informational landing page. The way that I want you to note here is the most effective messages were all of the ones that only included one message. So they were not the ones that included combinations of the different messaging that we tested. And just to show you that a little more concretely, among landlords that received a letter or a postcard that only had quote unquote one motivation, so one of those messages, about 0.8% clicked through to the website. Among those that got a combination of messages, just under 0.7% clicked through. So this is not the most, I guess, intuitive finding. And I think we have a lot of research left to do to understand why different combinations of messages may be more or less effective than single messages or more or less effective than other combinations of messages. But what it does show is that the message does matter at least a little bit. And I think this points to at least one area for further study. And there'll be a few others that I'll wrap up with. The next finding, as you remember from a few screens ago, we tested postcards versus letters. Letters dramatically outperformed postcards in this context. So landlords who received a letter were significantly, almost twice as likely to click through to the website as landlords that received a postcard. And remember, the content on these were exactly the same. So this is in line with some other research that my team and I have done around sort of the design of government communications, where we found that more formal communications are often more effective than less formal communications when coming from the government. In this context, a letter looks more formal, it looks more official than a postcard. So that's our hypothesis as to what's going on. But again, definitely, another area, another finding here that probably warrants further research. So all in all, before I break for Q&A, I think what we can take away from these two studies is landlords clearly face large logistical and psychological barriers to participating in voucher programs. And it seems like, at least from the evidence that we have so far, the psychological barriers, the stereotypes about tenants with vouchers, may be even more consequential than the process barriers. This is important because a lot of the narrative in the US right now is focused on trying to simplify the process of participation. And I think From what we're seeing, that's certainly important, and it likely could and would make a difference in participation, but it's not going to get all landlords over that final hurdle to accepting tenants is what we're seeing. Second, we find that small variations in messaging may impact engagement, but as I said, this is one area where we need to do further research, and my team and I are trying to do this right now to better understand what is it about the specific messaging or combination of messaging that's really driving the differential interest. And then finally, future studies, as I said, should explore methods of reducing logistical barriers and shifting beliefs about tenants. And in particular, one thing that we're trying to do next is really try to target landlords that could participate. So as most of you probably know, one of the big challenges in doing this type of work is simply finding landlords with a vacancy who can accept a tenant. Most landlords, most days of the week, don't have a vacancy. And so it's really hard to find, it's really hard to implement targeted outreach or messaging. That's why we saw such low engagement rates in our study, with less than 1% of landlords ultimately engaging with the mailer on average. So one thing that we're trying to do at the People Lab is figure out a way that we can have more timely and targeted messaging directed to landlords who might actually be able to take action in that moment by accepting a tenant. So that's one thing we are working on right now. So with that, thank you all again for having me, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you so much, Jessica, and my apologies again for starting a bit late and muddling up the start of the meeting. Terrific presentation, absolutely fascinating. I know the system is quite different, but some of the things you describe here chime with behaviours and attitudes in the UK, so that's very, very interesting to hear. If anyone's got any, would like to ask a question or make a comment, you can use the chat box or you can raise your hand. Do let me know if you'd like to come in. But just whilst I'm waiting, one thing for me, I think one thing you mentioned, Jessica, and I'm not sure this applies everywhere or just in the first case study you mentioned that before properties were let under the voucher scheme, they were inspected. Is that true? Every property is inspected. Can I ask who carries out that inspection, and to what end? Is this to make sure that the property is some decent standard, or what is the aim of that?
Yeah, it's a great question, and sorry for not going into more detail earlier. So as part of the requirement for every voucher program, whether it's state-run or the federal Housing Choice Voucher Program, any landlord that wants to rent to a tenant with a voucher has to undergo an inspection of their property. That inspection is undertaken by whoever is administering the voucher program. So typically it's at the county or the city level. So in Minneapolis, it's the Minneapolis Public Housing Authority that administers the state's voucher program in Minneapolis, and we also administer the inspections. The inspection is ostensibly to make sure that it is a safe environment for the tenant. But one of the really sort of big complaints that we hear from landlords is that there's a lot of variation in how that inspection is carried out, and a lot of sort of ambiguity in what inspectors are looking for, and they may ask for fixes that require a lot of money to fix, and that to landlords seem arbitrary. So we've heard everything from, you need to have like window blinds that are in working order to more logical things like you need to have a smoke detector and a carbon monoxide detector.
And do state authorities have the means to conduct all these inspections? Is it onerous for them?
It can be. So it really depends on the jurisdiction. In Minneapolis, where we did the first study, they tried really hard to get the inspection wait times down to a week or two, but that's still a long time to wait for both the tenant and the landlord. And if you fail the inspection, then you have to wait for a repeat inspection after you fix it. So it is quite onerous, especially when there's no clear guidelines for what is required to pass an inspection, and when it varies dramatically based on who is conducting the inspection. I think you're on mute, Stephen.
I've got a couple of questions in the chat box. Let me take those one after the other. So, Anna Lerner, could you put your question, please, but first introduce yourself?
Hi there. I'm not joining from a particular organisation, although I've worked in the home sector. But it sounds, yeah, it's really interesting to hear about. I've dealt with a lot of landlords, and I wonder, I don't know other than to reword what I've said, but partly I wondered, you mentioned once we saw the percentages, I kind of came back and I wondered how significant those findings were, because they were such low percentages. And I know you were saying further research was needed, but given they were fractions, I wondered how significant. I was also curious, you answered some about the process involved, and I think you said it could take 2 to 3 weeks and some of the inspections that would be involved. But I wondered if it would be any easier once a landlord had already gone through that process. You know, then it would be easier for them to maybe take on more tenants, or, you know, stick with this program as well.
I'll just take one other question as well, Jessica, if I may. So, Fionn Price, you've got a question too. Could you introduce yourself and then ask your question, please?
Hi there. Yeah, so my name's Finn. I'm here from Assisted Accommodation. So we're a supported housing organisation in London. The sort of relevant to my question here, so we would deal with something quite similar in terms of trying to support people moving on from our service with entering private rented accommodation using some form of housing benefit. My question was as to whether there's any kind of research around landlords who've previously engaged with vouchers for one of their tenants, and whether, having had that experience, they're more likely to do so again in the future.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Stephen, go ahead.
Yeah, Jessica, back to you for those. You can take those 2 questions. Sorry.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you guys for those questions. Yeah, so to start with just from the top, I think in terms of how significant these findings are, you know, this was in Massachusetts, the second study I showed, this was a mass outreach. It was completely untargeted. So we just sort of blanketed the state. Every single landlord in the state got a postcard or a letter. So the outreach rates the response rates are actually around what we would expect. Like, on average, probably not more than 1% of landlords in the state at any given time, you know, even have a vacancy to, and so if you don't have a vacancy, you know, saying, can you accept a voucher tenant is not super relevant or useful at that time. So they are very low. As far as how significant they are, I mean, I think seeing a 68% difference in engagement between the most effective and the least effective message is actually quite a substantial difference when it comes to this type of intervention, like just very light touch behavioral nudges, as we say, to try to motivate engagement. So what that tells me is that the message does matter to some extent. We just don't know why. We don't understand sort of at this point, what is it about the different messages that's driving that difference in engagement? So I think that's one area that we really do need additional research. The other question that maybe you're alluding to, and that I would agree with, is we don't have any sense at this point of what type of engagement we would expect from a better targeted sample. So if we didn't do mass outreach, what percent of landlords who actually have a vacancy right now, who could accept a tenant voucher today, could we actually get to engage with the program? And so that's another area for further research. To the second part of your question and the second question, which I think are related, around landlords that have previously engaged. So logistically speaking, unfortunately, landlords who have accepted a voucher tenant in the past don't actually have that much easier of a process if they want to accept another voucher tenant in the future. There's relatively little precedent for many of these public housing authorities. So, even if you've had your unit inspected for a previous tenant, you still need it inspected for your next tenant. That said, landlords who have the experience of going through the process at least understand what it entails, and so are likely better equipped to undertake the process for a future tenant. As far as research on whether these landlords who have previously engaged are more likely to do so, the existing research actually suggests that they're less likely to. This is an area, again, that we really need further research, but of the studies that exist, it seems that landlords who have previously accepted a tenant with a voucher are substantially less likely to accept a tenant with a voucher in the future. And we think this really gets to sort of negative experiences, both with the process and the tenant themselves. But this is one area where one of the reasons we conducted the qualitative interviews that I mentioned is so that we can try to dig into this a little bit further.
Brilliant. Look, I'm afraid I need to move on. Jessica, huge thanks for being with us and for that presentation. I think you may have to leave us, but obviously you're welcome to stay as long as you can. Most grateful, fascinating presentation. I'm going to turn next to Ken Gibb, who's going to talk to us about lessons from rent control in Scotland. Ken is Professor of Housing Economics at the University of Glasgow and Director of the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence. Ken's research interests are broad, and he's undertaken a fantastic range of research projects on a wide range of issues. Ken is a member of the Scottish Housing Investment Task Force. He chairs the Short Life Working Group on Housing Affordability and serves as a member of the Centre for Homelessness Impact, a committee member of Shelter Scotland, and a member of the board of Clyde Valley Housing Association. So a fantastic range of experience. You're most welcome, Ken. Good to see you, and look forward to your presentation.
Thanks very much. So my presentation is, I guess, somewhat different from the previous one. It's more of a kind of narrative, and it's a narrative that doesn't really have an ending either. But don't let that put you off. So yeah, I'm going to talk about the recent experience, really going back to 2016 or so, on rent control in Scotland, setting it in a broader sort of context, and also thinking about the role of evidence and expertise from academics and other researchers in terms of how they do or do not influence policy, and perhaps where the levers are most strong. So I want to start just a little bit preamble about rent controls in the private rented sector and regulation. I suppose the place to start is that the UK in 1988 significantly deregulated the rental market. So as a part of policies developed by the final Thatcher government of the three Thatcher governments, which basically meant free market rents and short fixed term tenancies, and considerable landlord opportunity to end tenancies through, in particular, this notion of a no-fault eviction, allowing them to do that. So you do get a sense of precarity in the sector. And then over the next 20 years, really from the mid-1990s onwards, but particularly after 2000, really remarkable growth in the private rented sector. And interesting because it was unplanned. It wasn't really active policy. It was created by the work of building societies and letting agents to create a new product, the buy-to-let product, which led to significant growth in the sector. And really, if you look now, the sector is twice the size it was, more than that in some places in 2024. It is still dominated by this buy-to-let small-scale landlord investment, but there's also corporate investment, institutional investment from build to rent. And set against that, the growth in short-term lets, the sort of Airbnb phenomenon, which in some sense is a substitute, and where landlords sometimes leave the sector to go into that, or vice versa, but they are often in competition. There is some evidence in Scotland that the sector has now plateaued and may actually be shrinking again. That seems to be evidence of landlord exit, though only emerging evidence of property exits, in other words, that are very atomized rental landlord sector may be beginning to concentrate and consolidate a bit, rather than necessarily all the units leaving the sector. What makes Scotland different, I think, is that obviously for non-British participants here today, it's important to say that housing has been largely devolved since the 1998 Scotland Act and the process of devolution across the UK led by the Blair government, and a process of forces and interests and stakeholders led to the 2016 Scotland Act, as well as a number of earlier bits of re-regulation of the rental market. But what this Act did in principle was it ended short-term or fixed tenancies, creating open-ended tenancies wherein landlords could only get their property back with a number of very specific finite grounds. And so in a sense, the tenancy moved towards something which looked like a tenancy without no-fault evictions and a considerable rebalancing of the sector. And in a sense, that's what we've been living with since it was enacted at the end of 2017. There's not much evidence really on the specific effects of that on housing outcomes and other outcomes. What we do know is that if you compare, we did some difference in difference analysis with the Urban Big Data Centre in Glasgow, which suggests that the regulatory balance in Scotland running up to when COVID lockdown started 2020, comparing Scotland with comparable English regions, that rents did not rise as a result of these greater pieces of regulation. If anything, they softened a little bit. So perhaps the regulatory change was bought in before the was priced in before the thing was introduced. We're not quite sure, but certainly that's emblematic of a sense that there wasn't a huge negative impact associated with the 2016 Act, certainly not in the early years of it. A second related thing, and just after this period, is that Scottish Government introduced a 20-year housing strategy, a comprehensive housing strategy, but it was never particularly clear what the role of the private rented sector was within the housing system that was envisaged, other than that there was a kind of ambition to reduce the speculative and kind of asset focus of housing, including that of the landlord, and a greater interest in income returns rather than capital gains. How that would actually work in practice wasn't particularly well specified at the time. But I suppose that the reason I'm here and getting beyond that kind of background is that although it was not mentioned at all in Housing to 2040, we've become much more interested now in rent control. And the reason for that is largely a political thing. When the Scottish National Party won the 2021 election, they didn't have a majority. They then sought out an agreement with the other pro-independence party, the Greens, Scottish Greens, to form a coalition. And when they set up that coalition in 2021, one of the two ministers who were appointed, and in the Butte House agreement, which set the coalition up, said there would be a national rent control policy, and it would be initiated by this Green party minister. And if you know what's been going on in the rather tortuous politics in Scotland in recent times, you'll know that the Greens were sacked earlier this year, so the coalition ended, and that led actually to the ultimate demise of the First Minister of Scotland and his replacement. But just before they were sacked, a housing bill was introduced, which includes this rent control, this national rent control policy, and it's unclear what's going to happen with that, but it has been introduced into the parliamentary process. So because of this interest in rent controls, we've spent a lot of the last 3 or 4 years doing work in the private rented sector, particularly in Scotland, particularly with my colleague Alex Marsh. We've been doing work for the Tenants Deposit Scheme and their Scottish subsidiary through their charitable foundations, a 3-year programme on regulation. We did an extensive international evidence review, trying to follow up very humbly on the excellent work that Steve Malpezzi had done around 2000. We also did a policy brief and kind of European analysis for the government in 2022. We also convened a Holyrood cross-party group on housing sort of assessment of what these rent control proposals might actually look like, what would be desirable. We did some academic work, we've done further conference papers, and we've just recently provided some written and oral evidence to the Scottish Parliament in relation to this new housing bill. Now, this rather odd-looking diagram on the right-hand side is a schematic heuristic thing we used in that written evidence, which is really an attempt to just describe intuitively the sense that there are many different stakeholders with different interests involved in debates about rent controls, and they tend to fall into different quadrants here between people who are anti-rent control and pro-rent control, and those who view the thing in a normative way, this is how it ought to be, or in a positive way, let's see what the evidence says. And the point about this is that it's not really where any one of these lands specifically, but it suggests that there's a lack of a stable coalition that takes a clear sense of what the direction of travel ought to be with rent control, which is perhaps one of the reasons why there's so much policy volatility. So not laying any great claim to any specific position of social scientists, activists, landlords, housing economists, etc., but it's really to give that impression of that instability, which we think is very important. So quite briefly, I just want to take you through what's happened since 2016. One interesting part of the 2016 Act was that it did introduce local bottom-up rent pressure zones, which were borrowed from Ireland and were really an opportunity to create a kind of third-generation rent cap on rent increases in existing tenancies. But the challenge that the system always had was that it was on the local authority at the bottom-up level to identify where such rent pressures existed and to provide compelling evidence that they existed, and required the Scottish ministers to then approve of them. And the reality is that not a single local authority has ever introduced one of these rent pressure zones. They're still on the books, but they've never ever been used. And this led to a sense that there's a complete mismatch between the policy aim of seeking to create affordable rents in the private rented sector and the data and the analytical capacity required to actually deliver that on a consistent basis. So one answer to the form that rent control ought to take, which the Scottish government didn't, they said they were basically going to seek evidence on this in 2021. One answer is to find a better way of doing rent pressure zones, since there was some kind of policy infrastructure there already in place. Then something really unexpected and dramatic happened in the autumn of 2022. In the midst of the energy-induced cost of living crisis, the Scottish government announced, really out of the blue, that they were going to freeze all private rents and actually all social rents as well for 6 months, and then have a rent cap across the board afterwards. I should say this was only for existing tenancies, not for new tenancies. So if you were entering into a new tenancy, you could still set a market rent for it. So this was tremendously popular with sitting tenants, as you might imagine, but created a whole set of issues for landlords considering new investment, for the build-to-rent sector in particular, which essentially stopped, it disinvested as a result of it. And we saw a really rapid rise in new let rents in Scotland, which were actually for a period the largest in the UK. And it was clearly a reaction to the fact that landlords were unable to raise rents for the tenancies that were continuing. So we had in many respects, the kind of classic way of not to do this. We had a national, across the board, flat rate policy with no recognition of different market contexts and local places, and we completely left one part of the sector regulated and able to increase rents as much as it wanted, and the political uncertainty, scared away some institutional investment. So this and the social landlords were able to basically end. They were able to negotiate away their that they should face a rent freeze and then a rent cap. They've been able to carry on the basis that they had done beforehand to that, which is different from that position in England. So this was quite a shock to the system, and it remains an important part of the background as far as the private supply side is concerned about the form that these rent controls might take. So we finally had this new legislation earlier in the year, after a long, extensive period of consultation over tenants' rights. It's not just about rent controls, it's also about homelessness prevention, and it's about some additional tenants' rights as well. But basically what they've come up with is what I would call RPZ, or Rent Pressure Zones 2.0. It's still this notion of local authorities identify rent control areas, as they will be called, and they have to generate the data and the evidence and the analysis that justifies Scottish ministers in putting caps on rent increases. This will apply to new tenancies as well as existing tenancies. We have a landlord registration system so that all properties are registered by a local authority level. So local authorities will be empowered to seek rental data, property attribute data from individual landlords. But it looks like even if the legislation remains as it is, it will be at least the end of 2026 before all this will be up and running and in place. So there's a transitional period in between times, and we have a very convoluted transition now that the rent cap has ended for existing tenancies. And as I say, the current state of play is incredibly uncertain because the Greens are no longer in government. The SNP are thinking quite hard about what they might do with the bill, and that's something that we await to find out. So I've just got a couple of general comments to make really about what's been going on in Scotland in recent times, and it's been interesting to see that we really don't have a stable coalition about this. We have tenants, activists, a lot of think tanks and other groups who are very strongly in favour of relatively strong rent controls for affordability reasons to protect tenants' rights. We also have a lot of groups of people who are opposed to these controls. The institutional investors being an obvious one, the landlords in general are, although they're actually not necessarily opposed to more third generation, more stable type rent control. And over the period that we've been talking to government about this, it was really hard to get a handle on where they were actually heading and what direction they were heading. And they were taking evidence from places like the Netherlands and Sweden and elsewhere. They certainly read our evidence, and they certainly listened to what we had to say without really seeing how they viewed it. But they did end up going back to essentially where they started, a slightly more nuanced and enhanced rent pressure zone with a route to get the data that they had trouble to get. But there's still no clear vision about the private rented sector, and also I think a failure to really accept that the rental market is very segmented, and what works for one part doesn't necessarily work elsewhere. And also, this is all happening in a context where we have big budget cuts in the capital expenditure programme for social housing, and there's a kind of a sense that this isn't joined up with complementary policies for affordable housing for those private rented tenants on low incomes who could be in social housing or affordable housing if more of it was being supplied. So a sense that I think also that rent controls perhaps are addressing symptoms, and in the short run makes sense to do that, but they don't address underlying causes of market failure and system failure. And it's in that sort of context that we're left thinking, well, what's going to happen next? So from our point of view, it's been a really interesting process to be, at different stages providing evidence to the ministers and trying to talk these things through. But as we said in our International Journal of Housing Policy paper, we are pretty clear that academics in these kind of debates often do not shape the actual aim of policy. The aim of policy is determined by the government and advisors, etc. But once they've set the kind of aim in place, they are much more open to listen to how you make good policy and how you design policy more carefully. So our emphasis has shifted quite a long way from an evidence review about rent control towards good policy design and those sorts of issues. And I've given this kind of discussion in various other places, including recently a conference in Turin, where it was interesting. A lot of the European countries are much further down the road with this. They've thought about the nuance and the context of how rent control policies can have a modest impact on affordability, but a recognition there's lots of other things that have to be happening alongside it, particularly on affordable housing supply. So I suspect we have more lessons to learn from our European colleagues than there are lessons from Scotland to them. But there might be lessons from what's happened in Scotland to the rest of the UK. We've been speaking to the Welsh government, for instance, quite extensively about this. So that's really all I wanted to say. It's an unfinished narrative. I think it will continue to develop over the next few weeks and months. I've got a few references here from work that's we've been doing in all of this. And the final thing it says, most of this stuff you can access through the UK Collaborative Centre for Housing Evidence's website. So I'll finish there, Stephen. I think you're on mute, Stephen.
Absolutely fantastic, Ken, and definitely relevant to the rest of the UK. So many thanks indeed. Incredibly clear, most useful presentation, and there really are lots of lessons there for us to learn. Are there any comments or questions? I'm very conscious we are so tight for time, which is my fault. Would anyone like to come in? You can obviously make a comment, put a question in the chat box if you'd like to. Anyone burning to come in? If not, given we are so tight for time, that was a fantastic presentation, Ken. This ought to be broadcast nationally or something, but so many useful insights. I'm going to move on, and I'm going to move on to Gregg Colburn, who's joined us. I know, Gregg, that you've only been able to join for your session. You're going to talk to us about the housing cost burden faced by renters in the United States. To introduce you, you're Associate Professor in the Runstad Department of Real Estate at the University of Washington, co-chair of the University of Washington's Homelessness Research Initiative, and a member of the National Alliance to End Homelessness Research Council. Your research interests span widely across housing and homelessness. So it's great to have you with us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Good morning from Seattle. And I'm going to share my slides here and jump right in because I know we're running a little short of time. So I want to make sure I can get through this and get you back to your day.
It's there. And thank you so much for being with us, Gregg. Much appreciated.
Oh, my pleasure. Are you able to see my slides?
Perfect. It's there perfectly. Right. Yeah.
Good. Well, it's a pleasure to be with all of you, and thanks to the Center for the introduction. I joke that I'm on a personal mission to bring the worlds of housing research and homelessness research together because they have been bifurcated for a long time for many folks, and I fundamentally believe that housing affordability issues are homelessness issues, and therefore I'm pleased to present this paper and in this context. As Steve mentioned, my research includes both housing affordability issues and homelessness. And so I've done a range of studies, largely in the United States, but some comparative international work as well. And this particular paper that I'm going to be presenting today that I co-authored with colleagues from the University of Washington and the University of Minnesota. Chris was a PhD student when he was at Washington and now is on his own, which is wonderful. Is really about the third paper in our research agenda around housing cost burden. And the other papers that we published on this topic started with Ryan's paper and mine back from 2018, which was looking at rent burden during the Great Recession. And then this team put together a paper on racial disparities in housing cost burden. And then we have a fourth paper that was just published, which is looking at some of the effects on children of exposure to housing cost burden, looking at behavioral and educational outcomes. And so it's been an interesting trajectory of research for us. So in this paper, what we're trying to do with this paper is really to add to the existing stock of research on housing cost burden that is largely based on cross-sectional data. For example, the Joint Center at Harvard, which is wonderful, publishes numbers each year saying X% of the population is housing cost burdened. And that is all helpful, but it's based on cross-sectional data. And our previous research does that as well, for the most part. And so what we're trying to do here is use longitudinal data to understand the experiences of housing cost burden for households that are exposed to this particular state. And just to get everyone on the same page, when I say housing cost burden, I'm referring to housing costs exceeding 30% of household income. When I say severe housing cost burden, what I mean is housing costs that exceed 50% of household income. And one of the nuances here is sometimes people include utility costs in that number and sometimes they don't. In this study, we don't, and I can tell you why later on. So what we're looking at is rental costs divided by all sources of household income, which would be wages, earned income, plus other government benefits. And so the idea here is by using longitudinal data, we can understand and conduct spell analyses, looking at entries into and exits out of cost burden status, understanding the duration of exposure to housing cost burden in a specific spell, and then also looking at recurrence. How quickly do people, and how quickly do they re-enter that state? So the idea for this paper really came out of our reading of the poverty dynamics literature, which actually began back in the 1980s with the Bain and Elwood paper. And the idea of that was poverty at that time was really being thought of as a cross-sectional phenomenon. You either are or are not experiencing poverty. And what Bain and Elwood did and subsequent authors did was say, we really want to think about the dynamics of this and looking at spell duration, entries into and out of. And so what we learned from the poverty dynamics literature is there was a lot of cycling in and out of poverty. And for many people, exposure to poverty was a relatively limited time frame. There was a subset of people who had long exposures to poverty, and that was obviously highly problematic, but there was a lot of in and out. And so what we wanted to do is use a similar logic and apply it to the concept of housing cost burden. So to do so, we use the panel study of income dynamics, which is based at the University of Michigan. It is a fantastic data set if you have not had exposure to it. It's US-based. That's one limitation, but it follows a set group of households for over 50 years, and then their children enter into the data set. And so you can really get a sense for a lot of different outcomes, but particularly around poverty and housing costs, it's really effective. And so what we do is we use the PSID to understand exposures to both 30 and 50% housing cost burdens. And we focus on 4 outcome measures. The first is spell length. That just means what's the duration of a spell once someone enters housing cost burden. The second measure is the aggregate exposure over a 10-year period, meaning you might have 2 different spells and that might account for six years out of 10 years. And so there would be 60% aggregate exposure in that 10-year period. We break it down by decades. You'll see when I show you the graphs. The probability of a new spell, and then the probability of recurrence for someone who's currently not experiencing housing cost burden. And all of these will then give us a richer understanding of some of the pressures on households who face housing cost burden. So existing research in the United States suggests that about half, 45 to 50% of households experience housing cost burden. This is, in the last 5 years or so in the United States. And that number has about doubled over the last half century. So huge increase in the prevalence based on cross-sectional data of housing cost burden in the United States. And so what we want to do is understand what is driving that increased prevalence. And I think the dynamics analysis allows us to shed a little bit of light onto that question. So these are descriptive statistics from our sample. And what you'll see is these are inflation adjusted. And what you can see is our data goes from 1970 to 2019, broken out by decade. So each dot here represents the outcome in that particular decade. So we have the 70s, 80s, 90s, aughts, and then the 2010s. I'm not sure what we're calling that decade yet. And this is indexed to 100. And so what you can see here is this is really the dynamic that explains the increased prevalence over the last half century, regardless of what data you're using. what's happened on an inflation-adjusted basis is household income among renters has fallen by over 10 percentage points, while rents have increased by over 10 percentage points. And when you combine those two, or you put them in a fraction, what you're going to see is rent is consuming a much higher percentage of household income than it did back in the 1970s. And that obviously is a major problem for households that are looking to finance other household consumption, such as food and transportation, education, healthcare, et cetera. There's just less left over. And as Matt Desmond said in his book, Evicted, the rent eats first, right? And so we got to pay the rent, and then whatever's left over, we got to figure it out. And so this has become a big problem. So I apologize that this is small, but if you want to dive in more deeply, you can find this this study in the Journal of Urban Affairs. This is the summary statistics on our 4 outcome measures. And so I'm going to spend a little time here just walking through what you're looking at. So in each box, it's one of our outcome measures, and you'll see that there are 2 lines. The solid line is 30% housing cost burden, and the dotted line is 50% housing cost burden, meaning severe. So if we start in the upper left, you'll see that's spell length. And this is saying what the predicted mean spell length is in each decade for the 2 outcome measures. And so just to orient you, I'm going to walk through the 30% housing cost burden numbers for you. They're a little small for me as well. What you can see is it starts at about 1.5. So the average spell of housing cost burden at the 30% threshold was about 1.5 years in the 1970s. And by the end of our data set, it's over 3 years, 3.2 years. So there has been a doubling in spell length over that time period. When you look at 50% housing cost burden, it's actually been more than double. It goes from 1.1 to 2.4 years. So pretty pronounced increase. In panel B, we have aggregate exposure, which is the number of years, the percentage of years that you're exposed to housing cost burden. And what you can see is, again, there's a doubling. It goes from about 15 to 30, meaning 1.5 years on average to about 3 years on average. And it's been a tripling for severe housing cost burden from 4 to 12. We then go to panel C, which is the probability of a new spell. And what you'll see is the probability has increased, but it's not as dramatic as it is in terms of aggregate exposure or spell length. And then the probability of recurrence actually falls. And we actually spend a lot of time trying to understand how we want to explain spell recurrence. But part of the problem is you have so many more people entering housing cost burden, and they're in there for a longer period of time. So the odds of recurring are actually lower because you're taking at-risk households out of the sample because they're already experiencing housing cost burden. And so one might say, well, this is good news, but the probability of new spell is still going up. That's really the more problematic statistic from our perspective. So that gives an overall view of the 4 outcomes that we were interested in this paper. And then what we do is spend a little time is disaggregating these, both by socioeconomic status and by race, because that tells also a really important story. And so here, what we're going to do is disaggregate by socioeconomic status. The metric we use here is households that have a college degree or more, or households that just have a high school degree or less. And what you'll see is pretty pronounced differences in especially aggregate exposure and probabilities of new spell between higher and lower SES households. And so while this has increased for all households, it has become increasingly problematic for people with lower socioeconomic status. When we transition to disaggregation by race, what you'll see again is white households and then households of color. Again, a pretty significant difference here between households. Because the PSID is not a huge sample, it's very hard to disaggregate by specific race. So we try to do this by Black, Hispanic, et cetera, and the sample sizes aren't large enough, so we had to aggregate those categories, unfortunately. But we do see kind of sustained challenges here. What you'll see is in aggregate exposure, you have in the 2010 to 2019 time period, the average household of color has 34% of the time mean years of exposure, whereas it's 26 for white renter households. And those differences are statistically significant. One of the other key stories here is that housing cost burden in the 1970s was disproportionately experienced by the lowest quartile household income, or lowest income households, between 75 and 80%. And so if we break up the income distribution into quartiles, you can see the black is the lowest income households, and then lower middle, that accounted for basically all of the households. 98, 99%. By the decade of the 2010s, what you can see is upper middle and actually even upper income households are now starting to experience housing cost burden. So this problem, again, continues to be of primary concern for our lowest income households, but we're seeing it creep up the income threshold, which is problematic. We don't want anyone to face housing cost burden. The cynical side of me suggests that this is an opportunity, because when problems start to affect the middle class, we end up taking different policy responses. And so, I do think it's important for us to highlight the fact that housing cost pressures are no longer only being felt by lower income households, it's being felt by middle income households, school teachers, firefighters, et cetera. And that tends to motivate politicians to act. And therefore, we should take advantage of that, because it will hopefully then obviously help the lowest income households as well. So the dynamics of this phenomenon have certainly changed over the last half century. There's no doubt about that. So one of the key takeaways here is that unlike poverty, which tends to be fairly episodic, spells of housing cost burden tend to be more sustained and they're longer. And therefore, we need to be thinking about policy responses that are sticky, unlike short-term poverty measures that sometimes people just need some short-term support and then they're off to the races. We're talking about multiple years of exposure to housing cost burden. Therefore, 6-month short-term benefits may not be sufficient to help with this particular situation. So one of our contributions we would argue is that this analysis helps us understand the increasing prevalence that we see in a lot of our data. More people are entering the state and the spells are longer once they're in there. That's why we have much higher prevalence in the United States. And then we have these really troubling disproportionalities by both race and socioeconomic status that require real focus. So one of the questions that we tried to deal with in our fourth paper was, we know that prolonged exposure to poverty is harmful. We have data to suggest that. What we don't have yet is a great data set to demonstrate that longer exposure to housing cost burden is also problematic. Intuition would suggest that that's likely the case, but we still need to build that out. So from a policy recommendation standpoint, this isn't novel. We either need to have people have more income, or we need to make housing more accessible, either through subsidies on the production or on the demand side. And so we're not breaking any new ground here, but what we're saying is, one, they can't be short-term in nature. They need to be durable, and they need to meet a far greater percentage of households, because this is becoming a major problem in the United States. And for those of you familiar with U.S. housing policy, our federal policies are relatively limited. 1 in 4, 1 in 5 people who are eligible actually get support. And so there are a lot of people experiencing pretty severe housing cost burdens that are not getting assistance from the federal government, and therefore they are left to their own devices in the private market with maybe some supports from state or local government, but that can be real challenges. So that's a brief summary of our paper. I will end it there, and I thank you for your attention and interest in the topic.
Thank you so much, Gregg. Another fascinating presentation, and great to see you using such long time series data. Fantastic insight. We don't have a lot of time, but we've got time for a question or two if anyone would like to come in, pick up on anything Gregg has said, or indeed, since I was a bit harsh on Ken, if anyone has any comments on the previous presentation, I'm happy to take that too.
Someone did send me a private note asking if this was gross or net, and this is gross income. It's before taxes, just to clarify.
Just whilst we're waiting for any other comments or questions, one thing from me, could you say a bit more? What do you think has driven the rise in rents, the housing cost burden over time? Is it is it a general lack of supply of housing, or what's behind that rise in rents relative to incomes?
Yeah, it's probably a longer story, but I do think the lack of supply is a major problem here, and especially in the last decade or so, post the Great Recession, multifamily construction fell pretty dramatically in the United States at a time when people were being pushed out of home ownership because of the foreclosure crisis. And so we end up having a bit of a perfect storm in terms of greater demand for rental housing and limited supply, and that just is, kind of a vice that's pushing these prices up. And we've not done a very good job, especially in our big cities, of accommodating growth. And so in my city of Seattle, we've had a massive tech boom, and we haven't built a lot of housing, and that has really juiced rents as well. So it's a big country with very different dynamics from city to city. So it's hard to give you one story, but I think generally speaking, we certainly have a supply problem. And I think we have a very residual federal policy around for low-income households, and you combine those factors together and you end up with a cost burden crisis.
Yes, it sounds very familiar on the other side of the Atlantic. Let me bring in Glenn Bramley. If you can introduce yourself, Glenn, and then ask your question, please.
Glenn Bramley, Heriot-Watt University. I'm just working for your department, Stephen, on updating indices of housing affordability. I found this paper really powerful. Thank you very much for that. And the time trends are pretty shocking. I mean, there are issues about how you define housing affordability, and it can be argued that these simple ratios are not the whole story, and it does depend where you are on the income distribution. 30% is a killer if you're already in poverty or destitution, but you might be able to bear it if you're further up the income scale. So maybe you need to have dual. But the other thing is, I really think we should sort of look at that question from the point of view of not the outcomes in terms of housing affordability, but what are the outcomes of unaffordability for households in terms of stress, financial difficulties, debt, that sort of thing, and also areas like material deprivation and possibly have effects and that kind of thing. So I think there's a big agenda to work on there, but it's great stuff. Thanks.
No, it's a very good question. Can I bring in Fiona Shilston? I think he's probing similar territory. Do you want to introduce your Fiona and then ask your question as well? I'll ask Gregg to respond.
Hi. Yeah, sorry, I'm struggling with the settings a little bit on the Zoom. I was just going to ask essentially the same question, thinking, not necessarily where housing cost burden results in homelessness, but what are some of the other effects, and what do we know about the effects of living in with housing cost burden on those who experience it?
Yeah, I think that to both Fiona and Glenn's point, one is, yes, there are other measures that are important. We discussed that in our studies. I didn't get into it today, but I do think it's obviously housing cost burden for an investment banker in New York City is very different than housing cost burden for someone making $25,000 a year living in Chicago. So we need to be clear about that. Not all burdened households are created equal, fundamental point. Fiona, to your point, we spent a lot of time thinking about this. Our first attempt at this is a paper that was just published looking at the effects on children, and we used academic performance and behavioral indices. And our hypothesis is that stress in the household has an impact on kids. And but doing that effectively from a research standpoint is difficult. And so I can put a link to the study in there for you. But I think there's a lot more work to be done on this. And I do think understanding some of the trade-offs that households make when burdened would be really interesting. And there might be some surveys and data sets that would allow us to do that. But this is kind of happy hunting grounds right now. We still have a lot to understand.
Fantastic. Look, Glenn and Fiona, thank you for excellent questions. I fear I need now to bring things to a close. We're almost at the limits of our time. I hope everyone has found the session useful. Huge thanks again to Jessica, Ken and Gregg. And huge thanks to Matt Gannon at the Centre for Homeless Impact for organising the meeting. Obviously, we'll let you have details of our next meeting soon. And in the meantime, do let us know if there's something you'd like to present at a future meeting, or if you've got thoughts on how we can make these sessions even more useful. That's certainly something Matt and I are going to think about what more could we do to get the most out of these sessions. But the feedback from the presentations in the chat for today's meeting are very, very positive indeed, for which I'm most grateful. But for now, huge thanks everyone. Thank you to Gregg finally for joining us for this last slot. We will be together soon. Take care everyone.
Thanks, Stephen. Cheers.
Take care.